When Daniel returns, he realizes that the rent for the booth hadn't been paid in 3 months. The partners hadn't been paid, and the girl in charge of finances had run away with the company's revenues. Hello friends, my name is Fidelia. Welcome to my channel where I share with you true stories from entrepreneurs who are building in Africa. And do I have a cautionary tale for you? These stories are anonymous and are primarily stories of failure and difficulty, specifically so we can learn from the mistakes of others when we ourselves go to build on the continent. The best way to learn is to learn from failure. By the way, if you have a story you would like to share, you can reach out to me via email and we can make that happen. I've left contact details in the comments below. Right, let's jump right in. But quickly, before we do, don't forget to like and subscribe. So this story is set in Congo, Brazzaville. And at the beginning of this story, this young man, let's call him Daniel, is unemployed, living in a studio where he is behind on rent payments. He calls on an older male mentor figure and he asks him to lend him some money to pay his rent, which the male mentor does. And after paying his rent, Daniel has $8 left. He leaves his house to go to La Corniche, which is a popular bridge in the Republic of Congo, overlooking the Congo River, to try to get some new ideas. While there, he sees a photographer and randomly asks him how his camera works, as he's never used a professional camera before. The photographer explains the ins and outs of a camera to him, and Daniel gets an idea. He asks the photographer to let him borrow his camera for $7, which is everything he had left after having paid for transport to get to the bridge that day. The photographer thinks this is a good deal, as that's money for him. Daniel spends that day offering photography services to people on the bridge, and he makes $50. Daniel realizes he can make a lot of money from this activity, so he continues renting the camera from the photographer on the bridge. Until one day, the photographer realizes that Daniel's making more money than him and decides to no longer lend him his camera. Daniel then decides to instead borrow a camera from an acquaintance and change his work location. He now goes to the city's zoological park to offer his photography services to people visiting the park. He pays entry to the zoo, takes pictures of people, and charges for the photos. He starts making around $120 a day taking pictures of the zoo. The owner of the zoo sees him being energetic and generally hardworking, and he offers him a contract to be the official partner photographer for the zoo. A contract worth $6,000, more than he'd ever made. He was over the moon. As well as being the official photographer, he would also be in charge of doing all the marketing material for the zoo. This turned out to be a lot of work. One day he meets 3 young people who are looking for work opportunities in the park. So he decides to train them in photography and marketing and hire them as his employees. All is going well, until one day he gets a call from his sister informing him that his mother was unwell and that they had to go and pay her a visit. At the time, he lived in Brazzaville, in the city, and the mum lived in the village. On the way to the village, however, he has a car accident and ends up spending almost a month in the village and having to leave his colleagues to continue to work in his absence for that period of time. After almost a month of absence, he returns to Brazzaville and goes to the park to get back to work. When he gets there, he discovers his business has been turned upside down. The 3 young employees he'd hired and trained had terminated the agreements with the park. They ended his business contract with significant partners, and they had spent all the revenue the business was making in his absence. This would have been in the regions of $3,000. On top of that, the third parties he worked with hadn't been paid. The rent he paid at the zoo for his spot there hadn't been paid, and the employees raised a complaint at the police station on grounds that their own salaries for the past month had also not been paid, despite them being the ones to spend all the income revenue for that month. Daniel was now in a lot of debt. He moves out of his studio, sells his belongings and his photography material to cover parts of his debts, and moves in with his sister. He is chased by police officials and threatened with imprisonment if he doesn't pay the employees' salaries. But after some time, the 3 young people who worked for him retract their complaint and confess that they had spent the company's revenues in his absence, or because they'd been jealous of his success. Daniel is advised by a family member to pursue the three young people in court, but he ultimately decides not to pursue them as it would cost him more money, and he was sure that they wouldn't have the money he'd be requesting anyway, so he decides to forgive them and move on. So at this point, Daniel is in debt and he lives with his sister, but he still has his photography and marketing business, and all he wants to do is to get new contracts and start working again, but he needs capital. One day he decides to reach out to a former client of his and he makes the client an offer. He offers a share of his company in exchange for investment so that he can relaunch business operations. He needs $8,000 in total capital. The former client turned investor promises to invest the full amount needed into Daniel's photography business. And a friend of Daniel's also decides to invest in the business. So Daniel is excited and begins to purchase what he needs to relaunch his business. Daniel purchases a new photography kit, rents out an office space in town, and hires a new team. But as they're about to start operations, the first investor only ends up investing $5,000 out of the $8,000 promised. And his friend only invests $800. Daniel doesn't have the amount he needs to fully relaunch the business. Despite this, he launches anyway and manages to bring in some work and be operational, but quickly realizes that the business is not profitable. Everything the company was making was then spent on a long list of expenses. So he decides to shut the office down. He lets go of most of the office staff but keeps the designer and begins working online. Once online, he gets a message from a potential client who is organizing a fair in the coastal city of Pointe Noire and needs a whole marketing pack prepared for the event, as well as photography services on the day. They're willing to pay $1,500 for the work. Daniel, again, is excited as this is the largest piece of work he's received in a long time. So he contacts the designer and they get to work. At this point, Daniel doesn't have the means to pay the designer, so he tells him he will pay him once the client remunerates them both for the work. The designer agrees. They create a full marketing pack for the client to promote the fair. Daniel submits this to the client and requests payment. The client tells Daniel to travel from Brazzaville to Pointe Noire, which is a 500-kilometer distance, to receive the payment. Nevertheless, they agree on a meeting time and location. Daniel arrives in Pointe Noire and heads to the meeting place to meet the client. But the client never shows up. Daniel reaches out to the client on his number, but receives no response. Daniel has never received payment for that piece of work to this day. In the meantime, Daniel tells the designer what has happened, but instead the designer believes that Daniel has scammed him, that he went to Pointe Noire to receive the money so as not to pay him. The designer reports Daniel to the police, who issue a warrant for his detainment. This is now Daniel's second time being reported to the police in 1 year in Brazzaville. So he decides to stay in Pointe Noire. Luckily, he has family there, so he decides to stay with a male cousin. While he's in Pointe Noire, he goes to visit the shopping centre called Mocha Shopping Mall, where various businesses often have stands. While there, he realizes that there is no photography booth in the whole mall, so he manages to convince someone who was renting a space to sublease his spot to him so he can set up a photography booth for those visiting the centre. The person agrees, and Daniel sets up and starts making some money that he uses to pay his debts. His booth becomes extremely popular and he starts making a lot of money as there is so much footfall in the mall. Daniel's success is noticed by the original owner of the stand, who then becomes jealous, so decides to no longer let Daniel sublease his stand. So Daniel asks Mocha Mall if he can be given his own spot in the centre, and they agree. He sets up, hires a team to support him, and starts making money again. As he was living in Pointe Noire with family, he noticed a nephew of his, around 20 years of age, who had dropped out of school and wasn't doing much with his life. Daniel decides to bring him into his photography business to try to help out the young man. Daniel starts to show the nephew all the ropes of his photography business. He teaches him the skills of photography. He introduces the nephew to all his business partners. He gives him access to all the accounts. The nephew begins to manage all incomings and outgoings, and he becomes the second in command. Then one day, Daniel has to go to Brazzaville to renew his national ID. He departs, leaving his nephew in charge. However, within a week of arriving in Brazzaville, Daniel begins receiving calls from partners that things at the booth were not going well. His whole team had quit because his nephew had told them that the reason Daniel had gone to Brazzaville was because the business was not doing well and he had no money to pay them. His nephew called partners to say Daniel was not trustworthy and he shut down the booth at Mocha. When Daniel returns to Pointe Noire, he has no team, no booth, and no revenues. He also finds out that his nephew was working with his older male cousin who he was living with because they were upset that he was making so much money and not sharing any with the family. The issue is raised within the family meetings are held, and ultimately it's decided that as it's a family matter, there's not much that Daniel can do about it. Daniel moves out of his male cousin's house, goes to live with his older sister. He starts to sell his shares of his business again to bring in some capital, and he receives investment from a friend of a friend who lives in France. The guy offers to invest $4,000 into the business, but finally only invests $1,000. Nevertheless, Daniel uses this investment to relaunch his booth at Mocha, but on a different floor, and hires a brand new team. He hires a young comedian he meets and trains him in the art of photography to support him at the booth, and they begin working together. Some time passes and he decides that he needs to take a break from running the business in Pointe Noire and decides to go to Brazzaville for 3 months. This time he has learnt his lesson and decides not to leave his booth with the young comedian he trained, but to find someone else. So he goes to his church. He speaks to his pastor, and the pastor suggests he hires his assistant to help Daniel while he'll be away. So Daniel hires the pastor's assistant to help him at the booth while he's in Brazzaville. He trains him in the art of photography and marketing. He shows him the ropes of the business and all the accounts. He gives him access to all the partner details and then leaves him to manage the booth alongside the young comedian. While he's away, the 2 employees report back on revenues, and Daniel notices that revenues start to dip quite dramatically. So the pastor's assistant suggests they hire a 3rd person to manage the money so that Daniel could be sure that neither him nor the comedian were spending the business revenues. So the pastor's assistant hires a friend of his, a young girl, to manage the company finances. All appears to be going well until Daniel finally returns from Brazzaville and finds that the rent for the booth hadn't been paid in 3 months. The company partners hadn't been paid in 3 months also, and the girl who was supposed to manage the finances had fled with the company's revenues. Mocha Mall start to demand that the missing rent be paid for the business to continue operations. Daniel doesn't have the money to pay, so he is forced to shut down the booth and give all of his photography kit and material to Mocha as some payment towards the unpaid rent. He later finds out that the pastor's assistant opened his own photography booth in Mocha with Daniel's old team and used Daniel's contact list to serve their customers. He also found out that his nephew and male cousin also opened their own photography booth and were doing very well. Daniel was not able to pay back his 3 investor friends and has not relaunched his photography and marketing business since. So, what is the moral of the story here? I would love to hear your thoughts on Daniel's story in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so for the next story, and I will catch you next time. Ciao.